You're listening to Females in Fantasy, a podcast elevating the voices of women authors of science fiction and fantasy who write about kick-ass heroines. I am your host, Brianna Da Silva, and this is episode 3. And today we're talking with C.B. Lee. Now, I don't like to play favorites, but I have to admit, this is one of my favorite episodes that I've recorded. Just the conversation that we had really encapsulated what my vision was for this podcast, and the day that I recorded it, I was just so excited afterwards and very happy. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We're talking about her book, Not Your Sidekick. And if you are a patron and you've been participating in our book club, then you will have just finished this book actually by the time this podcast is coming out. So that'll be probably really cool for a few of you who have just read it to then listen to a conversation with the author. I also have just finished it, and it is a really fun book, Not Your Sidekick. It's a very fluffy, non-stressful superhero story, and it's really a lot of fun, I have to say. I'm not actually the kind of person that usually is very much into superhero stories, but I really love this book. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation with C.B. Lee about intersectional characters and all sorts of fun stuff. All right, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being on. So before we start talking about your books, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into writing and the background and inspiration for the Sidekicks Squad series.
Sure. My name is C.B. Lee. I am an author of the Sidekick Squad series, as you've just said. I feel like I've been writing ever since, I was in middle school, I was in high school. I love stories. I love, fantastic things happening. I was an avid fan of fantasy and sci-fi growing up. And so I'd always been coming up with stories on my own. But, I didn't really think of it seriously as a career until 3 years ago when I first started writing and submitting my work to be published. And then after my first book came out, which was a fantasy romance called 7 Tears at High Tide, it was an interesting position for me because I had a publisher. They were interested in me pitching books and ideas to them. So at that point, I was kind of open to, what ideas do I have? What ideas would I like to see out in the world? And that's kind of really where I first began thinking of the stories I would like to see. Because 7 Tears, my first book, I really loved it, but it was written directly in response to they were calling for an anthology. So the anthology already had this idea with a theme of summer love. And, I definitely had my own spin on it, but it wasn't I came up with the idea specifically for this anthology. So Sidekick was pretty much the first book that I thought of as a novel and written as such to be a novel. And that was kind of born out of frustration a little bit in seeing a lot of Asian American characters of color, queer characters in the media that were very often the sidekick or, supporting roles or the best friend or just kind of there to be either set dressing or they were there to help the main protagonist learn something, but they didn't really have a story of their own. And that really bothered me. And then I thought it would be a fun take on, I love superhero stories. I love a lot of, I feel like I was more in love with the cheesy, if we think back on the style of one of the first Batman series where you see the words bang and pow pop on the screen. It's really fun and cheesy compared to the current Batman movies or the most recent Batman movies where it's very dark and gritty. And that type of storytelling is fine. It's different. But I feel like Batman Beyond kind of took that dark and gritty kind of reboot style and then inspired a lot of people. And then so in the past 10 years, a lot of the superhero reboots have been dark and gritty. And I really wanted to bring a lot of fun back into the world. So I imagined a world that was really bright and colorful. And the very first scene that I thought of was about a girl who couldn't fly and that, before I came up with the character and the main plot, I was struck by the scene of the girl trying really hard to fly and she couldn't. And that's where Jess came from. And then I thought about who she was and why she was trying to fly. And I was like, oh, her parents are heroes. She wants to be a hero. And then the story just kind of grew from there.
Awesome. That segues very perfectly into my next question, which is, can you tell us more about the main character of the first book in the series, Not Your Sidekick, and then like how she's like you and not like you?
She is the daughter of two superheroes in her main town, and she really wants to live up to their expectations and thinks that, the only way to make them proud is to be a hero herself. But she doesn't think, like in this world, if, usually people get their powers by like 12 or 13, whenever puberty hits. She's 16 and about to turn 17, and she doesn't have any power. So that's kind of where her frustration comes from. And she's really nervous about not being able to live up to their standards. And so she's like, well, I don't really know what to do with my life, and I have to figure out a way to, I guess, stand out on my college applications. So she gets an internship at a local tech company, and she gets to work with her crush Abby, which is both cool and awkward because Jess doesn't really know how to talk to girls. And then they kind of uncover this huge plot about the tech company is actually a front for the main supervillain, and then he's actually missing, and why is that happening? And there's this huge conspiracy that they uncover and then take action towards figuring out and kind of dismantling Jess's ideas about heroes and villains and her whole perception of them in this world.
What are some ways that
you
would relate to? Oh yes,
answer the second question. And how is she like me and unlike me? Jess is also bisexual, and she's also Chinese and Vietnamese American like me. When I first wrote her, I was like, I thought of her as like Asian American, but I didn't write her as specifically like correlated with my identity so strongly until I was like, why not? Like, why not make this character this specific? I guess someone has called it like a niche before, but it's not really. I feel like it's real because there are real people who are at this crossroads. And so, and it's been really, really amazing to hear feedback from readers and people that I meet who are so like blown away and tell me how meaningful this is. Like not only a queer character, but a queer character of color, because, a lot of times when people, do create characters or, a representation in media that they think like, oh, okay, if a character, if character's gay, they are the gay character, or they are, that's who they are. Or if a character's black, they're the black character. And they don't think of who they are beyond that one aspect of their identity. And so, and there are people who are at these intersections. There are people, who are more than one thing, definitely. So that's kind of where Jess is like me. Another way she's like me, she's also super awkward. I also do not know how to flirt or talk to girls, or guys, or anyone that I'm interested in. But it's and then there are ways that like she's not like me. I feel like the way I read her, she's very stubborn and can be strong and learns how to be a hero in her own way. And she also can be kind of unobservant in certain ways. I don't know if I'm like that or not in certain ways, but I don't know. There was some, like, we talk about differences, but I don't know. She was a really fun character to write. It definitely was not like an autobiographical character in any means, but yeah, she had a lot of my experiences. Well, not, in this futuristic world, there's still like, I wanted to preserve aspects of the culture and that Jess's parents are immigrants, but, in a different style but it still like echoes kind of the similar sentiments where Jess feels like she's not, she doesn't feel enough of one culture or too much of another and doesn't know where she really fits in. There's a scene where she goes and orders like some sandwiches at a Vietnamese restaurant, and she orders in Vietnamese, and then the cashier doesn't understand her, and And so she has to repeat her order in English. And this has happened to me multiple times where, and it was interesting because I just kind of threw that in. It's like, this has happened to me. I feel like it would happen to Jess. So I'm going to put this in. And then there were so many readers who like pulled the scene out and was like, wow, this really resonated with me because it happens to me all the time. And you think about, kids who grow up in the diaspora, and it was really great that the readers thought it added like this element of Jess's experience that they hadn't seen in before.
One of the things, like kind of going back to what you said a second ago about like it's, you don't usually have characters that are of, in different intersections. One thing that like frustrates me a lot, it's like there's this assumption that basically the default human being is a straight white guy, right? that's default, right? So if you have like, you can't go too far off from that. Like you might have like a queer white guy, or you might have like a straight guy of color, but then like and so yeah, like there's so much of that is just lacking because that doesn't reflect actual humanity, right? Like that is not like how humanity is. But then the more we write that way, the more it kind of like self-enforces, because then we like, it gets like kind of internalized, and people continue to churn out these characters that are just like one tick off from straight white guy.
Yeah, frustrating. It's hard because I feel like we've grown up with that as the default, so we kind of expect people to be able to relate to this like Joe Everyman, and and when we talk about like marketability and relatability, and then like why are these main characters getting all the like. There's a lot, like, you look at, like, the trend and, like, what gets funded in Hollywood. Traditionally, it's been, like, why are there so many variations of these guys that are, like, and people, like, one of the answers people give us is that, they defend their choices. But, like, because everyone can relate. And we're like, no, actually. Like, why do we expect people to relate to this? Like, why can't we? I feel like because we're human, we should be able to relate to people who are incredibly different from ourselves and like ourselves too. So you can find ways to relate to someone in the story, even if they're not exactly like you. And I find that builds empathy, and it makes you like, it builds empathy. It makes you aware of communities and helps you learn about people aren't like yourself. And I feel like it also comes back to like mirrors too, because for so long there are so many people who have not seen themselves, that we're starved for representation, that like, when you don't see yourself reflected in the media that you create, or if someone says like, this is an image of New York and it's only like white people, then you're like, well, that's not, then does that mean that I don't belong here? Like if this is a futuristic world and I'm not there, how can I see myself in the present, So that's, mirrors are so powerful because it gives you hope, it gives you validity, it gives you affirmation, because then you can be like, hey, that is also like me. I'm going through this experience, or I look like that, or, like there's a lot of great things that we can take away from having many different types of people and experiences to see on the screen and in books.
Yeah. I heard somewhere where it was like, there was some sort of, I don't know if necessarily a scientific study, but there was evidence that showed that when you're like people like watching like TV shows that showed, I think it was specifically dealing with like acceptance of queer people, where there was like a TV show and there are people that were watching it and they didn't have, like, they weren't interacting with these kind of people in their day-to-day life. But then seeing them on TV, like they're able to empathize with those characters and like, it's like had the exact same effect as knowing someone in real life.
Definitely. That's kind of why it's so important for like shows like when we think about like, I don't know, has it been like 10 years since Will and Grace been on air? I'm just going to guesstimate and say 10 years. But it was one of the first shows that showed like gay characters on the screen. And it was like a sitcom. It was like a familial, like you watch these characters in their day-to-day life. And then I feel like the impact of that show has been so much that it really changed the way like everyday people who didn't necessarily know a gay person, like it changed the way how they saw them. And I think the study that it's funny, I was going to bring this up, the study that you were mentioning, it was in the Scientific American about like reading fiction. And so and then they took a test about like, measured their ability to understand other people's emotions, and that like the participants who like read more fiction and genre fiction, that their results like significantly improved, like their capacity for empathy improved.
Oh, wow. That's really amazing. So I have not heard that study, but that is really cool. You said that was
Okay,
Scientific
so
American.
totally different study.
Yeah, totally different. The one
you were mentioning,
the one I was mentioning was something, it was a British TV show that was being like studied, but I don't remember the details. I think I heard it on like You Are Not So Smart podcast, maybe. I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I don't actually remember. I should look that up.
Oh, there's another study. I haven't read this one completely, but it's by Scientific Magazine, Science Magazine. Comprehends that people hold beliefs and desires and differ from other people's beliefs and desires, understanding people's mental states. Okay, reading literary fiction enhances mental states about complex social relationships. Da, 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 da. Okay, this might be the same study. Oh. We just talked about it. Yeah, you're right. It just came up when I Googled.
Two identities that I feel like that are represented by your character and by yourself, they often get erased. Like, okay, so bisexual identities, when day-to-day life, right? Like bisexual people were often assumed to be either straight or gay, depending on who we're with at the time. And then in media, like whenever there's a bi character, it's like they're not often ID'd as bi. And there's like this, like,
yes.
there's this hesitation to use the word, right? What's that?
I don't like to use labels, or like, what's another cop out? Like, oh, they're in a phase, or oh no, they're gay now. No, they're straight now.
And then also, this is not the same thing necessarily, but there's also like, the whole issue of like Asian characters getting cast by white actors in superhero movies, right? Mm-hmm. So these are two different intersections here that are often erased in media. So what are some ways that kind of come to the top of your mind that we can actively fight against this and just like bring queer Asian people to more visibility in the stories that we write?
Sure. I think the solution really lies in creators of content actively putting multiple types of characters on shows and in books, and showing not just like one character, but having multiple characters with different aspects of, their identity and different ways that they're experiencing life. Because if you only have one, then you have like all the pressure of being one. And like, there's no one person who can represent everybody. There's no, and kind of like, I'm just going to use an example of like women in movies. There's a lot of movies there's only one girl in the cast or in the story. And then this girl then has to be whatever she does then, because she's the only girl, then she has to somehow represent like all women. So if the girl is weak, or if she's strong, or if whatever, then she has that pressure of, because she's the only character that's a girl, and that's a problem. And if we look at the movies like where there are multiple women that are different, then you can see different ways people can be represented. Sorry. Like in the movie Mad Max Fury Road, we saw so many different types of amazing women. And we saw young women, old women, like physically strong women, disabled women, frail women, weak women.
You saw some like both too. Yeah, disabled and physically strong.
Yeah, people that are strong in different ways. And I really loved how that movie showed us types of different strength. I just saw the movie Black Panther, and no spoilers, but like there were so many different types of amazing women with different different personalities, different strengths, different, I loved how like we were just looking at superhero movies, and specifically Marvel, because they like the first Avengers movie, you have Black Widow, and then there are multiple female characters in this universe, but most often in most of their leading movies in the last, like, 5-10 years. Oh, they've been around for 10 years. Anyways, every superhero franchise movie had like one girl, and who was most usually the love interest, or like supporting role, whatever. And I love that we're starting to see, and sorry, continuing to use Marvel as an example because we're already
That's
there.
the one that comes most to mind. So
Yeah, I feel like Black Panther not only like set a new standard for like storytelling and visual and like being amazing, with pacing and everything, but also showing us what a world could be like. In every single shot, we would see women, being intelligent or kicking ass, or portraying, having their own story arcs that were not necessarily related to the main character, but not like you could see everyone had a role or had their own, like they didn't revolve around the main character. What I mean, like everyone has their own journey and desires that they're striving for. And I feel like I don't see that in a lot of main movies where all the supporting characters are there to like, here I am the mom of the character. Here I am, I'm the girlfriend of the character. And so I hope that more storytelling franchises will take and learn from, take it as an example and learn from some amazing things that have been done in storytelling recently.
what are some, maybe we could explore that just a little bit more. What are some things that you see where Marvel and possibly DC Comics, as there's like such a huge trend right now with making superhero movies, like what are some ways that you see representation improving, and then ways that you're not seeing it improving, or it's not improving fast enough? Like where are some places that they could still get better?
I think they're doing their best. They're trying. I love that we're seeing more characters of color get to be the hero in their own story. I loved. Is this still specifically Marvel or superheroes?
Just superheroes.
Wait. Also, sorry. Yes. Wonder Woman was like fantastic. Yes. Absolutely, like I walked out of the movie like so like excited and affirmed, like I'm ready to like take on the world. And just seeing how Diana could be like, she's empathetic and she can like coo at a baby and be like, oh my gosh, so cute, and also be like the same woman who's gonna like save the world. That she could exist in all these multitudes, like I thought was really amazing to show. And I think that and a lot of it comes too from having writers and directors and people in the editing process who come from these communities, that we're not having the same, like, if we change the dynamic of who is telling the story, then we're going to change the story itself. Like Patty Jenkins' vision for Wonder Woman was so spectacular that you see it in every single shot. You see it reflected, and even with like Thor Ragnarok by Taika, I can't pronounce his last name, but he's Maori, he's from New Zealand, he's also Jewish. He came to that movie, like he directed like a fun, very colorful, spectacular blockbuster, but he also used it to address like colonialism and like how do I learn from my society that has done these terrible things in the past, and like how do we break away and create a new society? Like it has these layers that you don't normally expect. But I think having like creators of color, queer creators, women at the forefront and getting them to like tell the stories and be a major part of the creative process is what changes. Like you can see it reflected in every layer of the work. Like one of my new favorite shows, One Day at a Time. There's an interview with the writers where they were talking about like their storylines and how much they rely on the writers in the LGBTQ community to craft this storyline for Elena. And then also the writers themselves, being Latinx and like having like it leaps off the screen, like it leaps off the page, especially with like Own Voices books. And I think about like, especially in the book community, when we see a lot of books written by like, we see a lot of books that are written by like people of color that aren't necessarily like, people don't know about them always, or like people don't like recognize them, I guess. Or I feel like it's, if we look at like an author coming from their own experience, like I feel like people of color are held to a different standard where they're met with much more criticism than if it was like a white person writing this story. Like it's been a trend of like people to borrow from like Asian culture and like people to write this like Asian inspired fantasy or whatever. And it's so often that like they're just using kind of those like set dressing details that like, oh, this is what makes like Chinese culture. It's the food and the clothes. If I have described the food and the clothes in my fantasy work, where things smell a certain way, or they eat certain things, or they wear certain things, that makes you think of like, it makes you evoke this like Asian style in your head. And that's kind of where some of the things I see in media that are like failing are, and we'll continue with Marvel since we're still criticizing Marvel's Iron Fist.
I haven't even watched that. I've like refused to.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I mean, I watched The Defenders, but only because my other favorite characters were in it. And the original stories, which came out, some 30, 40 years ago, it was a white savior narrative where Danny Rand travels to a fictional Asian country, and then this random guy from America, he is the one person to unlock all the superpowers in there. So he learns and he comes back and he does it better. Like that's his whole storyline. And Marvel really had an opportunity to, when they were casting and writing this show, that they had an opportunity to tell the story differently. Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, I've read a lot of articles about Iron Fist, and like it does a lot of, it still tries very hard, but it's still at the core, if the story is about this guy who's mastering a power that like, oh gosh, I saw this great post that someone was like, what if there was a show, like a reverse Iron Fist, where like a Chinese girl is dropped in Texas and she has to learn the art of like gunslinging, and all she does is fight cowboys. So we think about that premise, that's what they're doing with Iron Fist, because they had the opportunity where they could have changed the story away from its white savior narrative. And, if they cast an Asian American as the lead, then you have these layers of like, then you could study, you have that added layer of like learning about your own background. How does it feel to be diaspora? Does he feel like an outsider when he's studying in a foreign country with people that look like him and kind of talk like him, but he grew up with a different set of ideals and he doesn't quite fit in? Because I think the main criticism, like the producers and the writers were like, oh yeah, Danny Rand's an outsider, so we had to give the story to, like, we couldn't cast an Asian American. And we're like, well, yeah, they're also like so many Asian Americans who go through that every day. Like, the one, like, I visited like China and Vietnam with my parents before when I was young, and I felt very conscious of the way like people could look at me and immediately like they treated me like I was American, and in some ways I felt like it was even harder than like, there was that judgment of like, why don't you speak the language? Why don't you like, yeah, there's a lot of layers there. So
yeah, and it's like they're willing to explore some deeper themes in like some of these Marvel shows, but then others it's like they want to shy away from.
Yeah, and if we look at like Ghost in the Shell, and you brought up like whitewashing, and I guess it's either whitewashing or Iron Fist isn't whitewashing because the original character is white, but like there's another word for like they had an opportunity to change the narrative, and they did not. Whereas with Ghost in the Shell, we have a story that was very like, it kind of like, it was at the forefront of like Japanese anime movement, and just really inspired so many different storytellers. And one of the specific things about that story was, and we look at like what Netflix is doing with like Death Note and a few other things that they've completely done like an all white cast for, that like there are elements of it that don't work when you translate it to like, and it's just really, I feel like if you take something that has such cultural significance and then twist it so it's not like, that's not what it is anymore, and it's not, it's really, I don't know, there's so many layers of like why like whitewashing is wrong, and it hurts the community, and why people are like, all the things that people could have said, like, oh, we wanted to use someone who is in it, like, well known, so the movie could make money. But if you look at like
such an excuse,
yeah, it's an excuse. If you look at the box office, like, if you don't have a blockbuster star, this is an opportunity to make one. Find an
exactly
unknown. And there are like amazing like actresses who could have done that role.
It also has like a kind of a disturbing undercurrent, I feel like, that's being implied, where it's like you had a character who I forget where the story takes place for Ghost in the Shell. I don't know it very well. Is it where does it take place? Is it future? Do you know? Whatever. Okay, but you have a character who is Asian, right? And then she is, her like consciousness is uploaded right to like a kind of like robotic body, but then that body is European.
Yeah. Like why is that the new default?
Why? It's like, why is that their default? Especially when this company that's like creating these, robotic bodies is based in it. They're not based in Europe. So like, why are they? Is that like their ideal of beauty? Because that's a really terrible message. So we are actually running out of time. So I'm going to have to wrap this up. But this has been a very great conversation. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about superheroes, but I wanted to say just specifically about fantasy. And I think fantasy, like speculative fiction, sci-fi and fantasy, really has the power to like push the envelope more, because we're imagining new worlds, we're imagining fantastic worlds, and we have all these like adventure stories and people who want to see themselves as a hero. But it's these kind of stories that really give people the power to like, see themselves in a new amazing world.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to close this out. So where can people find you?
So I'm on Twitter at authors_CB Lee. I'm on, you can find me on my website at cb-lee.com. And you can, I'm on Instagram at cblee_CB Lee. And my books, Not Your Sidekick and Not Your Villain, the first two in the Sidekick Squad series are out. And also my fantasy novel, 7 Tears at High Tide, is also available.
Awesome. Well, I will see you around on Twitter.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
That was my conversation with CB Lee. It was actually kind of hard for us to wrap that conversation up. I think we both had a lot to say. And we actually did. We continued our conversation a little bit more after this and went a little bit more deeply into talking about Black Panther and Wonder Woman, and also why speculative fiction is a genre that gives us hope and helps us to think about the future in really exciting ways. If you want to hear the rest of that conversation, it is available to patrons at the $5 and up level. So you can head to patreon.com/femalesinfantasy if you want to hear the rest of that. And there are a lot of other really fun perks for patrons as well. If you want to stay in touch, you can follow Females in Fantasy at Females in, and that's the letter N, Fantasy, on Twitter. And one of the things that we do every single month, at least I've been trying to, we had to skip the last month because I had the flu. But most months we do this Twitter chat, and it's been going on for about a year, where we talk on Twitter together about different issues of representation for women in speculative fiction. And at the time that this podcast is going out, the next Twitter chat is going to be on April 14th. I better make sure I'm telling you the right date real quick. But yes, April 14th. And we're going to be, I'm going to be bringing on a couple people to join the chat as guest co-hosts. And we're going to be talking about biracial female characters in speculative fiction. So if you're able to come and join us on Twitter on April 14th at 8 p.m. EST, I would love to have you join this conversation. You can also keep up with me on Twitter at Brianna_DaSilva, or you can drop me a line at femalesinfantasy@gmail.com. I'm going to have a more professional sounding Females in Fantasy email address soon, but that's what I'm using for now. A big thank you to Mireille Gash, who made the mascot for the logo, and also to my roommates, who have been quite angels whenever I've asked them to help keep the house nice and quiet when I'm recording. So if any of you are listening, thank you. I really appreciate that. Just to give you a heads up for what's coming, in 2 weeks, I will be sharing a conversation with you with Dr. Darcy Little Badger, and we will be talking about decolonizing speculative fiction. And she is really cool, so I hope you enjoy that conversation. As always, I am Brianna DaSilva. Thank you for listening.